Version of a talk that I gave a couple months ago. Alan's already seen this talk for educational section for the Society for Effective Neuroscience uh, pre-conference workshop. And so I thought it might be useful to sort of share it with people here in the community as well, because I think only Alan's seen this material. So the concept for the educational session was sort of like to help people get up to date on fMRI processing. And so my talk was just some concepts I've found or I think are useful for keeping in mind if you're doing fMRI, especially in this day and age. So let's see. Oops. Okay, so first I think it's good to take a historical perspective. And so, we're coming upon the 35th anniversary of fMRI. So Eric was there at the beginning in 1992. And then, AFNI began in 1994. FSL was first released in 2000. Open fMRI, resting state fMRI was 1995. ICA 1998, which actually was here at UCSD. And then things like Open fMRI and the Con Toolbox and Multi-Echo ICA in the 2010s. The HCP project began in 2012, multiband in 2012, BIDS format 2015, fMRI Prep 2016, and now we're here around 2025, EPTI, and then I just saw that Meta offered a fMRI foundation model, so you don't have to do fMRI anymore. You can just use AI. So we've come a long way, and so the idea is how do you actually navigate and take into account this history? So it's sort of fun to go back. I figured, show pictures from, so the center has been here for about 25 of those years. So we opened in 2002. So for those of you who haven't seen these pictures, this is what this place looked like as we were building it. And back then, I think it was only Eric and I at that time. We spent a lot of time doing stuff like this to get images like that. Okay. And this took a lot of work at that time. Shoot ahead to last August, and this is the latest SEMA X, which we installed. And the nice thing about that is it's got lots of colors, first of all. And the next thing is, you get images like this with almost no work. You just push the button and this stuff just comes out. Okay, so we've come a long way in terms of how easy it is to do fMRI and also advanced imaging, like some really nice perfusion images, and then DTI is just all push button right now. Okay, so neuroimaging has come a long way in those years. And then the thing about fMRI is there's just so many things you could study. This is just a random selection of things that we've covered and in terms of topics we've looked at here at the center. And one of the things about fMRI is there's really no way any one person can sort of be an expert in all these things. And so the idea is how do you actually, what would be useful to know? And so I'm going to touch upon a few things today. I'm going to talk about probably global signal regression, vigilance and arousal, and some other issues that, not to say that those are the things you need to know, but as examples of how you might want to think about sort of taking into account the breadth of fMRI. And so one of the situations we're really faced with these days is that data is not a problem and analyzing data is not a problem. I mean, anyone can get data now. You either get your own data or you go to Open Neuro or some other database or HCP or ABCD and just download a lot of data. So you don't even have to be an fMRI to do fMRI anymore. You could just be an AI person and do fMRI. And then you not only don't have to get your own data, you don't actually even have to write your own software, to a large extent. And so, but the problem is then that leads to the issue that there are just so many ways of analyzing your data now. And so the question is, if you can analyze your data a million different ways, then you're likely to get a result, so then what do you do? So this is just sort of, for example, one example from a paper looking at 768 different data processing pipelines, and so it's sort of like, you probably get something out of one of those pipelines. And so the question is, what do you do? And then this is very different from the early days of fMRI, where Bob Cox, some of you may know, is the author of AFNI, and he basically said, you should understand what the analysis software is doing. So I think in the early days of apnea, that was maybe possible to a certain extent, but it's certainly not possible anymore, right? There's no way you're going to know what the software is doing, just the same way you don't really know how your iPhone works, right? Okay. Or most of you don't. I mean, I don't. So if someone does, please explain. Um, and then, there's these old school things like, manipulation of statistical formulas or software is no substitute for knowing what one is doing. I put it in your software. So this was something like, these are some quotes I used in slides back in say the 2010s. And I'm not sure that really that applicable anymore, just because there's no way you can actually know what you're doing anymore.
Yeah.
This is a personal perspective, so this is not like set in stone, but okay. But there's hope. Okay. So let's
Don't know where.
has anyone here seen the movie Sirat? Okay, so that's your homework.
How do you spell that?
S-I-R-A-T. Has anyone seen the movie Sirat? S-A-R-A-T. Okay, that's your homework. It was on the I'm not sure it won the Academy Award, or it was on the list of sort of films to watch. Okay. It's like one of these art film things, so you can't see it anywhere. But you could probably see it streaming. So some essential concepts. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how, just to sort of let people know and sort of get into your mind, that small processing changes can have large effects. Okay. So just to give you some perspective, this is from a Nature Protocols paper from 2018. It's still fairly relevant, just sort of showing these are the general areas. Like if you're doing resting state fMRI, these are the sorts of things that people do. They do things like, obviously, you're always realigning your data. You're probably maybe taking white matter and CSF components as regressors. You're probably doing some censoring. You're maybe taking out physiological nuisance regressors. You might be doing global signal regression. You might be doing ICA. You might be doing ComCore. Okay. So there's all these choices that you have, even just right off the bat. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about ComCore and global signal regression as examples of things that are small but can have large effects. So just to get everyone on the same page, what is the global signal? The global signal is essentially you take your data and you just, for every time point, you average over space. Okay. So you end up with, so these are just like an image of the fMRI signal in a single slice. And for each slice, I just average the data and I get the value of the global signal. So when there's a lot of sort of positive signal, the global signal will be positive. And when there's a lot of negative global signal, the global activity, then the global signal will be negative. Okay, so it's a very simple signal to compute, and it's for better or worse, it's sort of still around. Okay, people are still using it. And the main place people use it is something called global signal regression, which is basically, very simply, you compute this average global signal, and then this is the one line of code that's in a lot of pipelines. You basically just regress it out of every signal in your data set. Okay, so that's all it is. So whether you do this or not, it essentially comes down to one or two lines of code hidden in maybe tens of thousands of lines or millions of lines of code. Okay. So global signal regression was first done in the early days of fMRI for task-based, and it was immediately decided that we should not do this. Okay. And one of the reasons, this is an early paper from the group at University of Pennsylvania, basically showing that without global signal regression, you might get this as your activation map. And with global signal regression, you'd get this as your activation map. And you basically get very different sort of time courses of activation. And so very early on, so really no one knowingly does global signal regression for task space. Now, as we'll find out, you might actually be doing it under the hood, but you're not actually consciously doing it or specifying it. But for resting state, it's a much different matter. I mean, it's something that it's just so tempting to do that a lot of people end up doing it. And the reason is pretty simple. So for example, here in the top row, I'm showing you 5 different sort of resting state correlation maps that you'd obtain if you put your seed voxel posterior cingulate cortex, and you should expect to see the DMN network. But if you don't do any processing, then you end up with, really not usable sort of maps. If you do global signal regression, then at least in 4 of the 5, you've recovered, these nice, DMN maps. And here, questionable whether you've got recovered, just a lot of noise in this subject. Okay. So this fact is why it's quite popular. All right. And so, for example, people will use it, like they'll use global signal regression, and they'll say, well, if we do it, it strengthens the association between resting state, functional concavity, behavior. And then there was a series of papers in sort of 2005, 2009, where this is from Mark Rickel's group, very influential paper in PNAS. This is really where the DMN sort of marketing took off, right? I mean, before then, DMN was like, no one really knew about it. And then with this paper, it's sort of like, it became the really hot topic. And so in this paper, they basically showed that if you put the seed in the posterior cingulate cortex, you get the nice default mode network. And then if you look at sort of the anti-correlated area, sort of the, the task positive or attention networks, then you sort of have this really nice sort of 2 networks going on at the same time, sort of the yin yang of your brain going between the outside world to the inside world. And so for whatever reason, this really sort of caught on, and and default mode networks obviously been very useful in lots of studies, for example, mindfulness, right? And being able to manipulate the DMN. And so this sort of excited people quite a lot back then. But then one of the caveats with this paper is that these results are attained if you do global signal regression. So then a few years later, Kevin Murphy from the NIH group came out with a paper showing, well, this is just an artifact. This doesn't really exist in the brain, that if you do global signal regression, yes, you get these anticorrelated networks, but if you don't, you don't. And so there is no such thing as anti-correlated networks. And so then, for example, we wrote a paper and they wrote a paper, and this is almost 10 years ago, right? And you would think that this would have solved the issue. But even as just recently as 2024, there was a symposium to discuss this. And so I talked at this symposium, and the conclusion of the symposium is we don't really know what to do still. Okay. Okay. So anyways, so that's one thing where, just an example of how small processing changes can have a large effect, and we'll see that in more detail. But let's go to the next things where the sort of example of the details of the processing matter, but it's increasingly hard to know what those details are. Okay. So here's the example I like to use, which is, has anyone here used the Con toolbox or is aware of it? Okay, at least you're aware of it, right? So it's out of MIT. It's not the most widely used toolbox, but it's used quite enough that, most people know about it. So they came out with a paper, I forget what year this was, but this is the paper that made CompCore popular. Okay. So basically, they showed that if you do global signal regression, you get these sort of default mode network maps. But if you don't do global signal regression and you do CompCore, then you get these maps that also look very nice, and you don't have the issues of global signal regression. So this was like, oh, everyone was very excited. Now we can get these nice looking maps without doing global signal regression. Okay. And so, for example, CompCore now is like a part of lots of different toolboxes, including, say, fMRI prep, okay, which is a widely used toolbox. So here's the issue. So CompCore was invented here. Okay, so we were actually invented CompCore many years ago in 2007. It would be way before resting state became popular. And we invented it for task-based fMRI where you could actually know, at least have some idea of what the ground truth was and say, okay, we're not going to include components that have any task-based component in them when we're doing the regression. But then 2012, that's the Con group. Basically, that's when they published their CompCore paper, where their paper showing that CompCore could have these nice effects, and it sort of somehow avoid the issues of global signal regression. The problem with that is if you the in resting state you have no ground truth, right? So you can't really protect yourself from including regressors that may carry information that are related to the global signal. And so in this case, the issue is whether or not you include the global signal in your Concord regressors depends a lot on your partial voluming threshold. So for example, when we did our original Concord paper, we had very stringent threshold of like 99% CSF or white matter to include as a regressor. As far as I can tell, if you look under the con toolbox, and this is here where, unless you know what to look for, you'd never look for it. The regressor, the thresholds are probably 70%, which means there's a lot of partial voluming of your white matter and CSF with your gray matter. And you don't really need that much gray matter to sort of have a lot of global signal in your data. So for example, this from a review paper we had basically shows that this is what the global signal looks like just if you don't take out any regress, any things. And then this is what the global signal looks like if you take out the white matter and CSF regressor. So what it means is a lot of the global signal is in the white matter and CSF as well. And so this just means that the conclusion we made was, you need some level of caution when using white matter signals as a proxy for noise, because you're probably doing global signal regression. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The next essential concept, and feel free to stop me if you have questions. There will be some exercises later, so pay attention. So the next concept to sort of think about is that to take into account the underlying mechanisms of interpreting your data. Okay. So this example comes out of a study we did here quite a long time ago, where we did EEG fMRI, and that in itself is quite challenging, but it's doable. And so you get simultaneous EEG fMRI measurements. And the main discovery we had was basically that what we found is that the global signal amplitude is like sort of how big the global signal was related to an EEG measure of vigilance. So what you find is for people who are quite vigilant, so they have a lot of alpha power in the resting state, then you get these really nice sort of DMN maps, and this also corresponds to a low global signal amplitude. And and so that person is rather alert. And if you take subjects sort of midway between, then you get slightly larger global signal amplitude. And then if you take someone who's quite sleepy, so lots of delta and theta power, then you sort of see that the default mode network map is not as well structured, and this person actually has a lot of global signal amplitude. Okay. And so if you know that that's the mechanism, you start seeing this everywhere you look. For example, this is from the FSL group looking at HCP data. And so here you see the global signal amplitude increase over time. So those of you know the HCP data set, it's 15 minutes long. So what do you think is happening to this person over the course of this exam? They're falling asleep, right? Okay. And then even within a run, you're gonna, as you look at the data, if you actually look at your fMRI data, you'll see these patterns where sometimes the brain is slightly more negative, sometimes the brain is slightly more positive, and it turns out that that is also related to the state of vigilance. So even within the course of an exam, you're sort of falling in and out of vigilance, and that's going to affect sort of your brain fMRI signal. So one thing you could do is you could sort of say, well, this was some work we did where basically say, well, if I have my global signal, let me just look at all the points where the global signal is low and just keep those points in my data. And it turns out, so this is like sort of a type of censoring where you're just sort of basically throwing out all the points where there's high global signal. And it turns out if you do that censoring, then you actually end up with these maps that look almost like as if you did global signal regression, but you haven't done any global signal regression. You've just thrown out the points that there was a lot of swings in the global signal. Okay. So for those time periods you've kept, actually the anti-correlations are there. They're not a mathematical artifact. So we're going to do two case studies here, and I think what we'll do is we're going to divide the group the the room in half. So basically, everyone from Aaron on is on one half, and then you guys, you five are a group, and then slightly bigger. Well, we can make the group slightly. How about John and Aaron? You're in this group too. So six, yeah. So that's more equal groups. Okay. All right. So you guys get case study A, and you guys are going to get the next case study. But I'm going to explain both of them, and then we're going to take like 5 minutes for you guys to discuss and come up with your conclusions. Okay. So you guys, everyone pays attention, but particularly you guys are responsible for reporting back on what you think about this, and then the next group I'll explain. So case study A is basically what we just talked about, which is basically we're revisiting this controversy from 2005 and 2009, saying, is the brain actually anti-correlated? Or is there this actually yin-yang sort of organization of the brain? So given what we talked about, your job is to discuss that and sort of say, what is the current, assessment and hypothesis? Okay. So that's case study. Next case study is from a paper from PNAS, I believe. I forget what year this was again, but from the group at Yale. And so the idea was what they measured was they looked at the global signal amplitude in healthy controls here, and then in schizophrenic population here. And they found higher global signal amplitude in the schizophrenic population. And what they argued was that they had like this huge computationally modeling showing that there was just like the way that schizophrenic brains are organized, that they could model that and show that that would lead to a higher global signal. So I'm not telling you very much. I'm just saying there to explain this data, they had a very complicated computational neuroscience model to explain this one finding of higher global signal. Okay. So your job is to sort of think about whether you actually need a complicated explanation or whether there's a simpler explanation. Okay. So everyone understand their assignment? Okay. So give you guys about 5 minutes. So discuss. First group, what's the conclusion or questions, or what do you guys think?
That the GSR basically amplifies that effect of the negative correlations, but there's probably also some maybe smaller amplitude true physiologic components.
Yeah, I think the word due to global signal regression is a little over the top.
Okay.
And so I don't think it's, I would hope we came up with this is that Aaron was super quiet here, so he's not involved in this. You're pleading fifth. That's messed up. But that, there is anti-correlation. We do see it outside in conjunction with certain behaviors. We do see it when we don't regress out global signal. So if it's due to, I would say it's not due to global signal regression, but also when you have smaller sample sizes, they're harder to parcel out unless you do global signal regression.
Right.
But if we have larger sample sizes, we may, kind of get closer to the truth, without doing global signal regression. So I don't know if that
I think you guys all agree that's the consensus. It's not due to it, but it might.
I don't trust the
Maybe it's inflating a little bit. Making the boundary.
I'm not, there's no right answer.
Oh, you really believe that?
Yeah.
But this all, is there other experiments, other kind of data that's not this, that still shows the anti-correlation?
I think so. And you're one of the papers, actually. We did MEG and EEG. Yeah. So the one piece of information I didn't give you is that if you give people caffeine, it's also based by global signal regression. So what does caffeine do? Like given
Vasoconstricts, right?
vasoconstricts, but what else? Increase the vigilance, right? So if you have subjects who are more vigilant, they're going to have less global signal. So you're going to be able to see the anti-correlations much more. And we see the same thing with MEG, actually. If you give the subjects caffeine, this global connectivity decreases.
How does that relate to negative correlation?
How does that come back to this?
Well, basically if the whole brain is correlated, like here, right? Like you're being driven, this overall correlation is being driven by these sort of this state of arousal, right? Like low arousal. When your brain, like when you go to sleep, your brain just like gets very coordinated, like spatially homogeneous, and it's just like everything's going up and down. So then you can't see these interregional correlations. It's like obscuring it. It's like if you're on a boat, right, and the ocean's very like, choppy, then you're much, it's harder to see what's going on the boat. But if it's on a very smooth um lake, then you can sort of do your juggling or whatever. Yeah. So
Same phenomenon, and why you're saying that, like, when you regress on CSF, I think some of that too.
yeah, you are. Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer you guys? I mean, so yeah, I mean, you guys are pretty much right. Yeah. As right as anyone else could be in the field. Okay, cool. Let's go to the next case study. What were the thoughts on this? Like, do you agree with this final conclusion, for example, that net strength of overall connectivity is altered in schizophrenia? Is anyone here a schizophrenia researcher? No. Okay. So we're all on the same page. So we can. So what did your group sort of conclude?
As a principal.
Oh yeah, Ryan was taking notes, so
Yeah.
he can.
That's what you get.
So it was probably there's like larger ventricles.
Okay.
Increases the
Mhm. Okay. Any other factors?
Vigilance, attention.
Yeah. So what do we know about vigilance in schizophrenic patients?
Our group, not a lot.
Okay.
But we took the position that we wondered if it was controlled for and what measured in.
Yeah. I think there is, I mean, I'm not a schizophrenic expert. There is, at least when I look at it, there is data that suggests that there is less vigilance. If you actually measure vigilance in schizophrenic patients, it tends to be less.
Yeah.
So that would be that would be the Occam razor explanation for this data. They chose a much more sort of complicated explanation.
So, I love the word vigilance, big
Yeah.
fan of it, but vigilance for what? Like it.
It's just EEG visual. It's a metric that's defined, that we define. It could be arousal. It's just there are different ways of sort of in the resting state of looking at typically the ratio of alpha power to like delta and theta power.
Yeah. So in the context of resting state, if you're more, if you have greater arousal to, is it greater arousal to your own self-referential thoughts or arousal to the integration of your, I guess, in the Cartesian theater, the object or the precept or your environment? Is it the latter?
I don't know. I think it's more global. It's, if you're asleep, you're not very vigilant.
Yeah.
And regardless of what your attentional domain is, you can have vigilance to whatever domain, but it is that you are having, engaged with the construct of something.
Awareness. So awareness.
Yes. Yeah.
We're talking about awareness.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Awareness in any domain. Alertness.
Yeah, I mean the global signal actually like it's lowest at like dawn and dusk. So even evolutionary point of view, there's like time of day effects even. So basically when you need to be the most alert, then you're like when the light is sort of at that point where you better be pretty alert, then it tends to have lower global signal amplitude as well.
Okay, so Tom, the take home perhaps then is, do we need to run COVID? Do we need to control for some kind of scale that measures awareness or vigilance or arousal in our fMRI so that we don't mess with global signal? Is that, in other words, could that serve as a controller for what we're doing with global signal regression?
I mean, I think it probably depends on your sample size, as you're alluding to, whether you just hope everything averages out. And then maybe your population. like if you're looking at two samples, then you know one group has like schizophrenia or some issues of keeping attention, then that might be a confound. So I think it's just to be aware of these are the mechanisms that might be affecting your data. Yeah.
Does anybody have a study on time of day? Like seeing different points in the day for a similar outcome?
Yeah, so that was the where like I don't have it in this thing, but there is like if you look at global signal amplitude over the course of the day, if you send me a reminder, I can send you the paper. Yeah.
But I think you raised a good question, like vigilance to what? So maybe schizophrenic to you isn't vigilant because he doesn't, know there's a talk going on, but he's really focused on his own internal, schizophrenic thing that he's thinking there's a guy right behind me who's going to kill me, and I'm really focused on that. So he actually really is vigilant about that, but not to what the rest of the world would say is important, data. But so he actually may be very vigilant, but it's just that not what most people think of it.
Yeah.
So that.
Well, like,
completely different.
in a resting state, in a traditional resting state scan, you're asked to attend to the fixation point. And so if you don't have that capacity for an extended period of time, then that could be construed as less vigilance, I think. But what in the context of what Alan said, that's, I hate to use this word in this room, but we're talking about consciousness. Right? And awareness of whether it's internally or externally directed cognition or affect, which then, gets back to this point of perhaps people that have schizophrenia, they are very vigilant. It's just maybe not on what the task was.
Yeah. So, and there was a question online. There was one person whether these are medicated or not. I don't remember if they're medicated or not. The schizophrenia patients. So, yeah, and medication obviously would have an effect too. Okay, so last thing is substance. Yeah, as great. So basically, some of the things I heard you guys talking about actually tie into the remaining concepts. Basically, the next concept that is especially important for resting state is that significant correlation between most brain body signals. So what signal versus noise? The distinction is fuzzy at best. So, for example, if we look at what's correlated to the global signal, pretty much everything is correlated to the global signal. If you look at respiratory volume, heart rate variability, pupil diameter, which makes sense because that's how we measure arousal. So what you can do to measure arousal is you can look at pupil diameter or even eyelid closure as people start closing their eyes and get drowsy. So this is just some papers showing, for example, where they looked at these correlations and here they were looking at what's happening when there's a global signal change, and you could sort of see DMN deactivating, salience network deactivating, respirations changing, alpha power changing, heart rate changing, delta power changing. So everything is happening at the same time, as you would think if you're sort of falling asleep. A lot of stuff's going to happen. These are just some examples showing, like, if you take PC1 is sort of a proxy for the global signal in this paper, but you can correlate with heart rate, respiration, pulse amplitude, pupil dilation. So just the idea that everything is correlated with everything else. Okay. The other thing that's sort of interesting is that these this is looking in FD, which I think some of you know that it's measure of head motion. What they find is before you move the head, the global signal actually starts changing. So essentially, your head motion is also related to your arousal state, right? Yeah. And then this was one thing that sort of a paper we looked at where basically if you use like AFNI, Volreg, 3D Volreg, and you come up with your motion regressors, those motion regressors are very tied to the global signal because essentially the way a lot of the software works is they're just looking for, I want this image to look like this image, right? And so they're looking for changes in the image, and the global signal changes the overall brightness of your image. And so it tries some of the motion correction tries to fit that as well. Mm-hmm. And so even your motion regressors can be taking out global signal. Okay. And then finally, there was this paper. This is the case study. Okay, so this one we're going to do. Everyone's going to do it at the same time. So here you'll divide into like groups of 3 or 4, self-organized. So I'm going to describe the paper to you, and then you guys can sort of think about, what does this mean? How might you interpret this in the context of what we just talked about? So I'll describe what happened here. So basically, they looked at subjects who like high movers versus low movers, right? And what they found was that let's see, I remember this data. Okay. Okay, so basically what they found was you can sort of see there's mean motion. Whoops, sorry. So you have a group of low motion and high motion, okay? They took both groups and they scrubbed the data, which is basically they got rid of those. Scrubbing the data just means like you look for where they're moving a lot and you get rid of that data. And then you do your analysis after that data. So even after scrubbing the data, they saw a difference in those two groups, okay? Arguing that the neurobiology of the high movers was different than the neurobiology of the low movers, okay? As a control, what they did was they took people who just happened to be scanned twice, and in one set of scans, they moved a lot, and the other, they didn't move a lot, okay? And they applied the same analysis. They sort of scrubbed it, and I don't know why the P is different, but who knows? I guess the difference is, yeah, it's greater than. Okay. So in this case, there's no difference in the mean motion after doing the scrubbing. But then if you look at the correlation maps, there's no difference between those. It's the same subject, so there's no neurological difference. So this was the control. So the conclusion is that these findings suggest that motion-associated differences in brain connectivity cannot be fully attributed to motion artifacts, but rather also reflect individual variability in functional organization. Okay, so go ahead and self-organize, take a few minutes and see what you think. And if you saw this paper, how would you interpret the results? Given that I've only given you like 2 minutes of paper.
We just stay in the same groups.
Yeah, you stay in the same group or whatever. Or, yeah.
Scrubbing. So if there was a high motion, low motion group, did they scrub the same amount of time points from each? Or there's more scrubs from the high versus the low?
Let's just assume that they try to match things as well as possible.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know the details.
Yeah.
I don't remember the details.
Yeah, it probably had an FD block, is my guess. Like
Yeah.
a precision level. Yeah,
Yeah.
rather than the same.
But they might have tried to keep the time points like equalized, like reduced. You could always take the low motion group and say, I'm going to only take this many time points.
Yeah.
To keep. Let's assume they did the right thing.
Okay.
Morgan?
What did we decide? Like,
Well, I was just gonna put Aaron, who actually I think summed it up very eloquently, which is wiggly people are simply different than non-wiggly people.
Okay. That's the
There
point of
are
this paper, yeah.
You
Okay.
know, which is the brain, this paper.
Well, which should have been the title of this.
Yeah.
Wiggly people.
Just something different. He said,
what we were saying is like, it's not necessarily that those functional connectivity differences that you're seeing are because they're moving more, but there might be other sorts of traits that are correlated with also moving more that have these different like psychological associations. And that's like being seen there, which you're not seeing when you're looking at within a given individual when they're moving high versus low. But then we got into all of these like methodological qualms of like how much do we believe this and how much does the sample overlap and how much like
Yeah, so just for B, for the intersubject differences, you're taking the same subjects who, who have moved in one scan and not moved in the other scan. So that group would be inherently biased to the more wiggly people anyway.
yeah, exactly. Were those people mostly high movers or low movers?
And can I ask you something, Tom, here? I mean, and that Y scale is important. I mean, the difference between less than 0.4 to 0.5 millimeters, that's trivial.
Right, that's not something we're throwing people out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's not a lot. I mean, yes, it's movement and we want to clean it up a little bit, but that's not a gross level of movement that I would be concerned about. I don't know what that says about me as a neuroscientist, but I think, we put people in pain. We see movement.
Sure, yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just not that bad.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I didn't look at that.
That's.
Yeah.
But it's still statistically significant, even when it's small, because I mean,
Yeah,
it's clear statistical difference.
But it's
Stats
statistically
are
significant. doesn't
stats,
mean
yeah,
all.
it doesn't, stats are
Well, it depends on how many
problematic. If that's
people
what
do
the
they
title
have, how
should
many
be,
people
stats are a
involved.
problem.
I have another talk for that. Okay. But yeah, I mean, the only other thing I would add is it, like one thing that could affect these results is, you know, how they did the censoring, right? Like if we know that the stuff is happening before the movement, if you don't censor far enough back, then you might still be including those. Maybe those are the brains, it's driven by those brain signals that are preceding the, you know, those arousal modulations, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's no answer to this. It's just getting you to think about this.
This is getting me to doubt everything.
Good. That's the whole point.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, if it helps say that
It's all
points, you know, paper, A plus, I'll take the probably notion of 0.06 millimeters,
Okay.
which they're not, they meant to say 0.6.
Yeah.
So we just throw it out.
So
Yeah.
I'm just saying, you know,
Mhm.
believe nothing what they wrote.
Yeah. So anyways, this is just to remind you that everything is connected, and the fMRI signal you get out is
It's a great slide.
just lots of stuff. And then I like this quote: if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything, which is sort of equals fMRI. Yes.
So this is something that, you know, I struggle with in my lab, because sometimes we will, you know, especially if it's a novel data set, we don't know what's going on, there's breathing and all that stuff. I mean, does it make sense to look at data with and without global regression?
Yeah, I think so.
Like, it's not like cheating or anything, right? You're trying to see what's cleaner because this, well, it hasn't been reproduced. Yeah, what's truther? You know, and so that's something I like, okay, is this right? Because this is just better than my, but it's not really better than hypotheses. It's really, because you should have the data, like the groups de-identified or whatever, but it's really about, you know, which data are cleaner.
Yeah,
And-
or know your data as best as you possibly can.
Yeah,
I think that's always a good point.
that's the way I was training, and you know, nowadays it's like, okay, well, you should really just do it this way, but yeah, but if you don't, I don't want to interpret the lies.
Yeah.
You know,
Have
costs
an
way
A
too
priori.
much for that.
Have an a priori and then test parameters.
Right.
Okay, last concept, just to finish up real quickly, is the efficacy of pre-processing does depend on the application. So I just give an example of that. So, you know, obviously a lot of our processing involves regressing out nuisance terms. And so, for example, here are, you know, sort of, you know, global signal restoration. And these are the carbonate plots that I think most of you are familiar with, just showing that there's a lot of, you know, sort of, you can see these strong global effects in this data. And so typically what we do is we just, you know, use a general linear model or some other type of approach to regress the data out. And, you know, if you're doing like task-based stuff, it's pretty powerful, right? I mean, you can go from fairly noisy data and maybe use CompCore. So this is using physiological regressors using CompCore, and you can really clean up your data. So that's good. But there are cases where you actually can't clean up the data. So for example, is anyone here doing like dynamic functional connectivity? Okay, so this is basically doing functional connectivity by doing over a sliding window and then just reporting how that connectivity changes over time. And the idea is that it turns out that even if you do the regression, so for example, here is the dynamic connectivity, the sort of strength of it before regression, and post is the red after, and the global signals is what we're regressing out. You can sort of see that even before and after regression, your dynamic functional connectivity is still strongly correlated with this global signal. Okay. So it's also important to realize that just because you apply a method doesn't mean it's actually working for your application. You actually need to go back and look and see, is it still correlated with my regressor or not? Okay. This is like within a scan, this is over like different scans in different subjects, and just showing like if you had a group of subjects and you looked at their functional connectivity over subjects before and after regression, and then you also looked at like the white matter and CSF regressors, you can sort of see that there's, you know, even across your scans and subjects, there's a correlation of, you know, this functional connectivity with the strength of how much regressor they had in it, which means we're just not able to take out a lot of what's driving the data. Okay. So these were the essential concepts. And so then the recommendations are, at least you want to try to be aware of some of the key limitations of popular processing approaches. Try to take into account systematic differences in biology when you can, and sort of see how that sort of might influence your processing analysis interpretation of your data. Here, getting to your what you said, Fadol, considered alternate analysis approaches, but the caveat with that is that the unspoken multiple comparisons problem of trying lots of potential things where, for many papers, we don't know if that's the only way they analyze the data or whether it's like one of 1,000 ways they analyze the data. And that multiple comparisons is never reported typically, unless the paper is about trying different processing pathways. And you can sort of see, like, if you look at any of these papers that look at, like, looking at the same data and they have lots of people process it, people get different results depending on the processing they did, right? So if you just happen to pick one processing, you'd have a paper. Maybe you did another processing, you wouldn't have a paper. So.
Right, but I always think it's scary to only do it one way.
Yes.
One way is just you just hit pater.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
And if you analyze it 12 different ways and don't publish.
There you go. So that's why you should consult with your local fMRI guru, Alan. And anyways, just thanks to all the people at the center who contributed this over the years, and that's it. Yeah. So hopefully I was helpful.